And welcome back. More reports are emerging of atrocities committed against non-Arab ethnic groups in Sudan's Darfur region. And the United Nations has raised the alarm over reports of atrocities committed by the paramilitary rapid support forces during their capture of the city of el-Fasher. However, the RSF denies killing these civilians. The United Nations has now raised concern about the humanitarian situation and allegations that war crimes are being perpetrated on both sides of the conflict. Now, it is estimated that more than 150,000 people have died due to this conflict, while 14 million have been displaced from their homes. So to talk to us and share more about the situation, we joined virtually now by the Regional Director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, Hala Al-Karib, and the Executive Director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale School of Public Health, Nathaniel Raymond. Thank you so much, Ms. Al-Karib and Mr. Raymond, for your time this morning. But let me start with you, Ms. Al-Karib. For those who may not have been following this conflict so closely, what is the situation right now in Sudan?
The situation is extremely horrific at this point in time. We are witnessing an open act of genocides that has been in the making for a very long time. As civil society and activists, we have been producing reports warning the international community, the African Union in particular, about the nature of the ethnic targeting of the RSF, their history as well. Prior to being called the RSF, of course, they were the Janjaweed militia that were formed by el-Bashir previous regime, to suppress the revolts in Darfur by Darfur indigenous Africans movements. Right now, the RSF are committing, openly killing civilians, killing children, killing women. Sexual violence has been rampant in the region for a very, very long time. This is not the first acts of genocide that the RSF is committing in Darfur. It happened before in 2023 when the RSF has taken over Al Junaina city in the far west of Sudan, and it killed more than 15,000 people in a very short span of time. So it's, genocides and violence against indigenous African population is a strategy that has been adopted by the RSF since they were the Janjaweed militia and they were the allies of al-Bashir, and now continue to do that in alliance with many countries within the region, but particularly the United Arab Emirates.
So you've spoken about the African Union and, by extension, other international organizations. Given that yourself and your organization have been so outspoken, others have tried to document what's happening in the region. Why do you think that there has been very muted, if any, outrage from the international community about what's happening in Sudan?
I think it's such a shame, the silence about the atrocities that's happening in Sudan and what is happening in Darfur, especially, considering the history of Darfur. This is a region that has been in turmoil for over 25 years. This region has experienced atrocities, for very, very long time. And there have been several campaigns, and international actors are fully aware about the nature of atrocities, about the ethnic targeting, about the forced evictions of, massive populations of Darfur. Darfuri who were very productive communities, who were farmers, who were, cattle herders who had a very solid livelihoods. They were transformed over the past 20 years into displaced people across the big cities. And now they were being hunted, inside their displaced camps as well. So it's, what's happening right now, it's against the African Union core foundations and principles, the protections of the people in this continent, and that has not been happening. The only peacekeeping mission, the only acts of protections that the Darfurian Sudanese people had were the African Union, UN peacekeeping missions, and it was unfortunately seized in 2020 for no clear reasons, despite the fact that the region has never been stabilized.
Mr. Raymond, if I can come to you. So your lab has been tracking and analyzing data from Sudan. And given the information at your disposal, what does it tell you about the nature and the scale of the violence that is currently being witnessed?
In the past 72 hours, we have been monitoring the events in el-Fasher and the Darfur region of Sudan. And what we have seen is the sum of all fears. We know that the RSF are moving house to house and killing civilians, and we can tell that based on the presence of objects on the ground throughout neighborhoods where civilians, particularly from the Fur and the Zagawa groups, were seeking refuge. And we can see basically objects that weren't there before RSF took control, and they're the average size of a human body laying flat on the ground. In some cases, we can see red discoloration around the bodies, consistent with them bleeding out after being shot. And we can see RSF forces in pickup trucks with heavy mounted machine guns on the back moving house to house. What we're seeing now is a velocity and scale of violence that in my 26 years as a war crimes investigator has only been matched by Rwanda.
And speaking to that, because we've heard already terms like ethnic cleansing, we've heard the word genocide. If we look at the information at your disposal, Mr. Raymond, does it meet the threshold to characterize it as such?
Yes. When our lab, the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health, served as part of the U.S. State Department in the Conflict Observatory Program, we issued an internal document to the State Department, the National Security Council, the National Intelligence Council, basically saying that after the El Geneina massacre that Hala mentioned so rightly, we were already returning to a state of genocide. And then in January of this year, Secretary Blinken, in his last week in office, finally and correctly declared the RSF as committing genocide. What we're seeing now should come as no surprise. We should be horrified and we should act, but we should not be surprised that genocide has returned to Sudan.
So, Ms. Al-Karib, if I can bring you back in, this has been described as a forgotten war. Why do you think that is the case? Why has this fallen off the world's radar?
That's a good question. And I think it's primarily, the neglect of the African Union and the neglect of the African leaders has played a significant role. I think, they have been heavy influence from regional actors and countries within the Gulf, particularly the UAE, on many countries around the continent. And so there have been a complete silence about Sudan. So that's a primary issue. The other issue, the international community and the international actors, they are, there is no, the way they approach Sudan, they have been significant neglect, a lack of interest, and this crisis has not been approached seriously from the beginning. Contrary, in my view, it's allowed to happen. The fact that, the war is going to happen between Sudan Armed Forces and the RSF, it was an open secret. The scale of militarizations, the violence in Darfur, the violence in different parts of the countries, the pockets of violence, it has been clearly known to the international actors, but there was no interest in addressing this. And I as Raymond said, it's there is no surprise here, but there is lack of interest, there is neglect. And I think, the fact that this is an African crisis, those are indigenous African populations, we are not at the top of the list and often seen as dispensable. Also, I would like to stress, the fact that Sudan currently is the capital of sexual violence. Hundreds of thousands of women has been raped and gang raped and traumatized, and there is absolutely complete silence about this as well, and nobody's talking about it. Not only that, there is no allocated resources, to confront, this crisis heads on in terms of humanitarian aids, in terms of support, to Sudanese people on the ground. This is one of the humanitarian human rights crises in the world, but as I said, there is complete neglect.
And speaking about women in this conflict, we do know that, some women's groups are still trying to assist some of the victims and survivors. But how are they able to go about their work, Ms. Al-Karib? Like, I can only imagine how difficult it must be for them.
It's horrific. There is very few organizations and groups who are active on the grounds, and the risks surrounding these organizations and groups are massive. We and other colleagues, like on MSF, for example, working under very dire circumstances and fear as well. Human rights defenders, women activists, and activists at the front line, they are exposed to all sorts of violations. So, and that's one of the challenges, that, this crisis is in the first place a protection crisis. And this is what we have been saying from day one, that we do need to ensure, that Sudanese people are protected. It's not a fight over governance, it's a protection of civilians. That's the most important thing. And then, after we do that, it's the right of Sudanese people to decide how do they want to be ruled, and what kind of government they want. But unfortunately, the overall approach has been very, very suppressing and alienating of Sudanese people. And we are enduring, as activists and frontline, significant violence. Absolutely.
Mr. Raymond, and just coming back to the international community, how can we refer to this as a forgotten war when you have more than 14 million people displaced? The horrors that we do hear of are absolutely spine-chilling. So how does the international community then, go to bed and knowing that all of this is happening? And we are hearing about it. You are collecting data about it. What is their role? What should they be doing right now?
Government, the United Kingdom, and all the governments of the world should put the screws to Mohammed bin Zayed in the United Arab Emirates. On Monday, we learned in the Wall Street Journal through a leaked U.S. intelligence assessment that the U.S. intelligence community has known for months that the Rapid Support Forces have received arms directly from the United Arab Emirates, and that the pipeline of weapons, including weapons that our team at Yale have identified as being used in the fight in el-Fasher, including drones, has only increased. Right now, given the seriousness of the situation in el-Fasher and in Darfur writ large, let alone the Kordofans and the rest of the country, the main thing that the international community can do is to say to the United Arab Emirates, to say to Abu Dhabi, enough. And it's time for them to face the consequences they've feared in the Emirates, which is economic sanctions related to their role, not only backing, but the better word is enabling. And I just want to say, this is not a forgotten crisis. It's an ignored crisis. It's an actively ignored crisis. And there's a difference. It's time for us to stop ignoring Sudan and to start, as Hala said, protecting Sudanese people.
So is there any hope at this point for any sort of accountability while this war continues?
if there's any accountability, it needs to come from intervention now. We can't wait for the International Criminal Court. We can't wait for long attenuated processes for the people who are dying on the streets of el-Fasher tonight in a massacre that could kill more people by the end of this week. And I am understating how serious it is. We could lose more people in el-Fasher than we've lost in Gaza in 2 years. We could lose them in 1 week. And so the point is that the key accountability is showing the Rapid Support Forces and the UAE what they have not seen in 2 years of war, which is consequences for their crimes in terms of international pressure on their backers.
And flowing from that accountability, Ms. Al-Karib, what would justice look like for Sudanese women and communities right now?
I will start with the fact that Darfur has been under the International Criminal Court jurisdictions since 2008, I believe. The best that the International Criminal Court has been moving on the Darfur case is, extremely slow. The civil society organizations, people at the front line, they have been enormously supporting of the court, investigation process of the crimes that's happening in the region. Yet we have not been hearing anything from the ICC to date. So that was one thing. The African Union has established the fact-finding missions under the Human Rights Commission for Humans and People Rights. Still, we haven't heard anything. So our bilateral and international organizations, they seems to be not very much engaged in this sufficiently in these crisis situations. And that's a shame, in my view. That's a huge shame, and the fact that the people of Sudan are being left to this horrendous situation, all alone, without any support and without their voices to be amplified. And what's happening to them is such a shame. And, I think, from this platform, we are calling on our brothers and sisters in South Africa and our colleagues to really start speaking about what's happening in Sudan and to exert pressure on the South African government as one of the lead governments in the African Union, very influential governments, to start acting on the situation in Sudan as soon as possible.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. And indeed, this is where we seek to highlight what is going on so that it is not ignored, as Mr. Raymond says. So that was Hala Al-Karib, the Regional Director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, and Nathaniel Raymond, Executive Director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale School of Public Health, speaking about the mass killings in Sudan.